Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make a couple of quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This week, we're talking about a very big bad wolf. Voja is bonkers. 5 mana 5/5 is a nice rate, Vigilance and Trample are always great, and whenever it attacks, our entire board gets +1 counters for each elf we have, and we draw cards for each wolf we have. And oh yeah, since those abilities draw so much attention to Voja, Wizards decided to give it Ward 3. It's no surprise this commander has taken off in popularity. People like elves and wolves are basically dogs, and they're all good dogs, Brent, so the deck count has skyrocketed. It's got over 3,000 decks to its name already. That's over 1,000 decks more than the next most popular commander from this same set. I don't think there's any time to dawdle here. Let's see how this average deck looks by using the average deck feature on EDHREC and getting the deck list right into the Architect deck building website to see what we're working with. Let's cut right to the chase. This new Voja is busted in half. So busted that right now people in the comments are screaming at me for making a video about it because they just don't think that Voja players need any extra help. I've seen Voja get called a Craterhoof behemoth in the command zone who happens to be 5 mana, the buff is permanent, and it also happens to draw you cards. Well, listen, this is a video to help improve deck building, it's true. But if you're aching to beat this deck, then I think knowing a lot more about your enemies is probably useful recon so that you can find out their biggest weak spots. So whether you love Voja or hate playing against it, I hope this can highlight something important for you. As a reminder, any swaps we make to this deck list must either keep the total price of this deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the list. And yes, of course, we will have a more budget-friendly second version of the deck at the end of this video too. And real quick, I think you should know that people who like and subscribe to this video are less likely to encounter mana screw in their commander games, so make sure you've done that. First, core cards and strategy. Commanders that split between different creature types often beg the question of which side you'll lean into most. This average list biases towards elves at a ratio of about 4-1, 3-1, depending on how you count stuff like the token makers. There are, of course, a couple of elves who make wolves, and we can lean into changelings to help trigger both of Voja's effects. Indeed, this deck contains some really good changelings, and naturally, Maskwood Nexus is an all-star in this deck. If you have this with 5 creatures in play, you're now drawing 5 cards and adding 25 power to your board every time your commander attacks. And don't even get me started on how much damage we can dish out when we've got these in play, pinging off all of the counters that we're placing. Shalayan Halar and All Will Be One add another angle of attack to this deck in case regular combat damage gets fogged in some way. And all of these non-combat pings can just go buck wild. Our commander has Ward 3, which is also nuts. Wizards, what were you thinking? Meaning that we're at a lower risk of pinpoint removal ruining our day without it also setting that opponent far enough back that all of our mana elves will be able to outpace them anyway. Which means our primary risk of exposure is board wipes, thus making protection spells the most important things in the deck to try and find as soon as our commander starts drawing us cards. So, with that understood, where do we start with any upgrades? I think at first glance, a lot of us see Voja's card draw effect, and we feel this innate pull to add more cards to that deck that will yield it more value. Like, let's get more wolves in here so that we can draw more cards, right? But honestly, when this deck is like actually in motion, the whole team jumping up suddenly by 3, 4, 5 power each, and that pump stays there, that is the true terror. This deck can be wicked fast. It could end a game after just 2 attacks, sometimes just 1 attack. The deck doesn't just lean into elves because there happen to be more elf cards in the game than there are wolf cards in the game. This deck leans into elves because that much extra damage at this velocity can be a lot more impactful than just trying to accrue some extra value. It says a lot about a commander when its card draw ability is one of the less interesting aspects of the card. Voja is bonkers. I've seen Voja compared to Miram and Edgar Markov because of its brutal speed and how difficult it is to interact with. I kind of think it's wise to approach building Voja the same way that you might approach building Kyler's Guardian Emissary. When the commander is the source of this much extra pump, we don't need to worry too hard about, for instance, extra anthems, because we already have that part down pat. Each elf that we run is already an anthem, and each wolf is a cantrip, so we can use that guiding principle to bias us away from any effects that might be redundant and therefore find more utility slots. To that end, our first cuts are, in this humble brewer's opinion, cards that kinda lean into overkill territory. Hardened Scales and Uncivil Unrest help us deal more combat damage, which I just don't think we need. If we wanted an extra +1 counter from the scales, we could just play literally any elf instead. And Uncivil Unrest is a really cool card, do not get me wrong, but 5 mana is kinda tough here because that's already Voja's spot on the mana curve. I like the Riot effect on it, I just think we have other sources of haste that cost less mana to use, and the damage doubling effect when we're already often hitting for lethal just feels redundant. I think it's telling that the more tuned up and expensive versions of Voja decks in the EDHREC database don't play this card much at all, because they just don't need it. It's neat, I can't fault it, especially if you use it to help like your army KO one player while Voja commander damages another player, but if you don't have one already, I don't think the $11 this card costs is necessary to spend, because we already hit like a truck, and we don't need to turn that into hitting like a plane. Besides, Voja has trample, but the rest of the team doesn't. So instead of cards that just help us amplify the amount of total damage, my priority goes towards protection and evasion effects instead. And we'll get to some cards for those purposes in a moment. Before that, let's talk mana. This deck does elf things. It has elves as mana dorks. We have a few cheap ramp spells, and then also this solo Cultivate. We're not even playing a Kodama's Reach, that's noteworthy. And I also want to highlight Druid of the Anima here too. So listen, this deck don't need a Cultivate. That's just how elf decks are. And the Druid? I know we're all nostalgic for Alara, but like even a Paradise Druid would be superior to this thing. I'm not super worried about our color fixing though, so I'm actually going to exchange both of these for a Devoted Druid and a Viridian Joiner. Both of these mana dorks do very, very well with lots of +1 counters on them, which our commander provides in spades, so we'll be able to cast basically anything that Voja draws for us. Alright, real quick, we gotta talk about the wolves. So this video has me in a tough position. I'm gonna level with you, the best versions of this deck don't care about wolves, like, at all. They just go hard on the elves. They play Cemetery Prowler and a couple of the good changelings, and that's like all they need. Because it turns out most of the wolves are only okay, and taking a turn off to play them is a big deal when a deck moves as quickly as this deck can. Let's be very clear here, Voja turns this random automaton into a glorious anthem that also draws a card. This is why people are comparing this commander to Edgar. An optimal build of this deck means that you're prioritizing hyper efficiency to brutalize the table before anyone gets the chance to set up at all. Like, yes, wolves draw you cards off of Voja, but if you just build with an eye towards elves, you can just play all the usual draw spells that elves have been succeeding with for years now, and you'd still be good. And doing things that way means Voja never loses any tempo by having to take turns off from playing more elves that grow the army into high heaven. After all, Voja already draws a minimum of 1 extra card per turn just from itself. So to be totally honest, if we were to really crank this list up, we would probably cut a lot of the wolves and all the wolf-making things, because they're just not the most efficient way to make this deck great. And since Voja is earning a reputation as a busted commander anyway, we as players can start to feel like, well, what would be the point in holding back? Besides, one of the wolves in this deck is like $20. We'd probably save money if we cut the wolves and just went full elves. So why not just go for that then, right? I'm saying all this because I'm cutting some of the wolves and wolf makers, but not all of them. I think from a lens of just brutal efficiency, it's probably the right move to cut most of those wolves and wolf making things. But when I looked at the list, I just kind of felt that if I did that, I would kind of be ripping the spirit out of it, if that makes any sense. Like, players gravitated to this deck because they're excited to play elves and elves that make wolves. I'm upping the average. I don't want to overhaul the average. So yes, if you really are optimizing, it's likely that there are very, very few wolves at all in your final cut. But I'm going to try and maintain the original spirit of the list, I guess, and only cut the wolves and wolf-making cards that don't even make that version of the deck truly sing as well as it could. I'm cutting Arlen, Silverfur, and the original Tolsimir. Arlen can only make a wolf every other turn because she has to transform. Silverfur might never make a wolf for us at all, like who's targeting our wolves with pinpoint spells? Our opponents are digging for board wipes, not trying to pay 6 mana to Beast Within our commander. And Tolsimir, I love you, buddy, but 6 mana is a lot. The pump is redundant, and there's also a summoning sickness issue here. It's just not great. I left the other two Tulsimirs in here though, because it is funny, and they also at least make a Voja token right away. I'm also going to cut one more, and that's Pyreheart Wolf. I wavered on this because it is a form of evasion, and I do like that a lot, but with Voja's counters, that Undying ability is just never happening. And I kind of had another couple cards that I think will help us push more damage through in combat instead, so we'll bid adieu to this one for now. What are we adding then? Well, I said I wanted more evasion, right? I'm including Bramblewood Paragon in here, which gives the whole team trample, a lovely thing for our massive creatures to receive. Seriously, our board becomes like 8/8 so dang fast. We do not want a couple of chump blockers stopping our elves from having a grand old time stomping life totals. And on that note, I also kinda gotta troll people with Taunting Elf here too. Pyreheart Wolf was some evasion, but this one distracts all of a person's creatures. It could frankly be a full-scale delete button on a single player, guaranteeing that we clock them like a timesheet. And then, I add this to every Naya deck. Naya Charm is amazing, folks. I promise, it's so worth playing. The 3 damage part is cute. Who even needs that, though? Like, recovering one of our board protection spells from the graveyard, or using this thing to tap down every conceivable blocker. This card is so dang versatile. I love it. Get it in here. Now, I don't play a lot of tutors these days, but y'all, Moon Blessed Cleric is an elf. And that's kind of wild, right? Like, if you're in need of enchantments to give your dog the zoomies, or to give your whole team the go boom ease, I don't know, this just kind of seems perfect for a 12-cent card that will grow the army and find us exactly what we need. And okay, now to kind of cheeky spells. Listen, Shields of Velasfell and Volatile Claws are basically one-time versions of Maskwood Nexus. All our wolf is elf, all our elf is wolf. A board full of elves now draws us like an extra 4 cards for just a couple mana, or our board full of wolves is now pumping up way more. It's just hysterical. This is what the Commander format is all about. Finally, I'm going to swap a land around for some extra utility. I think Mutavault's important here. We lost an $11 enchantment earlier, and I think 7 of those dollars are more wisely spent on this land. A land that is also an elf, and that is also a wolf. Changeling's gonna do what Changeling's gonna do. Those are the official swaps, but I have a few honorable mentions before we get to the budget version of the list. Some of them are mana, to be honest, like Boseju's, maybe Hall of the Bandit Lord to make sure that your commander has haste, and let's be real, the Great Henge is indeed very great. But yeah, as I kind of mentioned before, if you're truly optimizing, souped up versions of this deck will cut those wolves to make room for better and better board protection and tricky red counter magic. A lot of those wolf cards are cute. I think a lot of them are really charming and funny. They're the kind of cards that I want to see in Commander games. But honestly, with how blisteringly fast this deck can be, the protection effects end up being a whole lot more important. High key, by the way, if you can find a Galadriel's Dismissal, that one's so good to either save your board or to delete blockers for a turn. What a wild card. Those are the final swaps, and now we have our first Voja list, which you can, of course, find a link to down in the description below. That's just the first deck list, though. Now, how do we make things a little friendlier on the budget? As with many a deck, a lot of the budget is concentrated in just a handful of lands and a small number of high-price cards. For this budget version of the deck, we're going to cut anything that is $10 or more, and end up saving about $300 on the total list. Expensive lands like Shocks and Fetches and Triomes, and expensive cards like Roaming Throne and Teferi's Protection, goodbye. We end up changing out about 10 lands and about 9 other cards, and drop the price of this deck down by more than half. We'll bid all those things goodbye and wind up with this slate instead. So what do we add in? First, land replacements. Tempo matters a bit here, so pain lands are my primary recommendation. Some are like $2, $2.50, but those are the most expensive things that I'm adding in this whole budget section. Horizon Canopy is also about that same price, and I'm going to throw that one in here as well. Alongside it, I like Sungrass Prairie and Mossfire Valley, because they can also fix our colors without disrupting our tempo too. We lost the Shocks and stuff, but we still have some dual type lands in this deck for our cards like Farseek to go and fetch, and the new Surveil lands are a little too expensive to add, so in that case, I think we'll have to take the tempo hit on the temples to make sure that we're still drawing into the cards that we need. Honestly, I like these cards in general anyway, so if these are our slowest lands in the deck, that still actually feels pretty good. Round things out by replacing that expensive Yavimaya with a regular forest, and we're in business, with a much less wallet-crushing mana base. I think we can feel pretty good about this. In general, it's safe to bias towards green lands here. You may find that you don't even need Boros duels at all, because this deck skews very, very green indeed. Now to the rest. We lost 2 board protection effects in the big budget culling, so I'm adding in a classic, Unbreakable Formation, and a personal favorite, Lapse of Certainty. These are both under 40 cents, and that white counterspell can really take people off guard, buying you just one more attack step to finish things off on your next turn. Highly recommend it. Second, we lost some amazing mana elves too, so I'm including the aforementioned Paradise Druid, and I'm adding in Grand Warlord Rada, cause it just seems pretty fun to me. This could generate a good chunk of change to help us play the stuff Voja draws. Speaking of draw, we no longer have some cards like Guardian Project and Friends, but I'm gonna be basic here. For straight up draw, just add a couple of wolves? Wolves that are also elves, that's my preference, though I know some folks might not like the 2 white pips on the cohort. Basically, in lieu of those $10 draw enchantments, we're adding in some wolves, because they're cantrips that wear counters. In effect, we are going all in on Voja as the source of card advantage. But Voja has Ward 3, I think we can get away with it. Also, this is kind of cheeky, but more haste means Voja hits faster, and that draws at least 1 card right away. Plus, more haste means faster elf mana too, so you really can't go wrong with extra speed. And Fires of Yavimaya is a very cheap card to pick up. Last, we lost some removal. Damnable Pact was a real heartbreaker to lose, but to replace that removal, I like Windswift Slice and Austere Command. There are other more one-sided wraths that I would prefer in general, but a lot of them are like $5 nowadays. Austere Command is it's straightforward. There's no use trying to reinvent that wheel. And much like the Damnable Pact, there are at least some occasions here where we can use it to press an advantage and make an opening for a more successful attack, rather than it just being a full board reset. Meanwhile, the Windswift Slice picks off some puny opponent thing and turns the excess damage into elf tokens that will soon become minimum 7/7s. Card good, nuff said. And those are the budget adds. But real quick, if you're out there trying to defeat Voja, what are the takeaways here? Well, the clear emphasis of this deck is how badly it wants to find board protection spells. Voja's not afraid of pinpoint removal because killing it is practically like time walking yourself. Ward 3 turns pinpoint removal into the cost of a Wrath spell. So you might as well just Wrath, especially since pinpoint removal means all the mana elves will just make Voja recastable anyway. It takes a very concerted effort from multiple players to keep Voja off the board with just pinpoint effects, and thus, board wipes kind of feel like one of the only answers to this type of aggressive deck. But a game that has 5 board wipes in it can be kind of a rough slog, so it's not like we want to pack our decks with a bazillion board wipes, so what else might work? Well, with all the ward running around, I'm personally getting more and more interested in changing some of my usual removal spells for ones that don't target at all and can get around stuff like ward, or removal that forces a sacrifice of someone's biggest creature. I think some effects like these are going to end up potentially more useful in a world full of so much ward. I'm not saying run more removal because that's asinine, just to consider if it's worth it to you to modify said removal. Ward is good against the expected, so don't be afraid to deviate into some unexpected stuff that your opponents may not see coming. Oh, and I've been saying this for a while now, but are you playing Fogs? I think you should play more Fogs too. Attacky decks can get really scuppered by these, and when they think the coast is clear and that they've got the game in the bag, that's a true moment of weakness. If your Fog also happens to remove their creatures, which I highly recommend by the way, you can even use it before Voja's trigger resolves to make sure that they do not get to draw any of those cards since the board is empty now. And also, listen, mob rule and reigns of power effects are funny as heck. You don't just have to try and solve problems from the lens of trying to remove it. Maybe you can solve those problems by using those problems. Just some dog food for thought. That'll do it. I hope that was useful for you. As a reminder, you can find a link to both versions of the deck list down in the description box below, along with a link to all of our deck lists, and you'll see the cards that were cut from the deck in the maybe board. Whether you're playing with or against Voja, I hope this was helpful for you. If you've got any tips about Voja, make sure you share them down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.